The spring of 1958 had been unusually violent across the Great Plains, with meteorologists recording more severe weather events than any season in recorded history. Tornado Alley lived up to its fearsome reputation that year, as supercells and devastating twisters carved paths of destruction from Texas to the Canadian border. But among all the communities that suffered nature's wrath that terrible season, none would face a fate quite as strange and horrifying as the small farming town of Millhaven, Kansas. Millhaven was the kind of place that epitomized small-town America in the 1950s, a tight-knit community of 847 souls nestled in the rolling wheat fields of central Kansas, where everyone knew their neighbors' names, and Sunday church services were as much about social gathering as spiritual salvation. The town had been founded in 1887 by German Lutheran immigrants who built their settlement around the imposing St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, whose distinctive bell tower could be seen for miles across the flat prairie landscape. By 1958, Millhaven had evolved into a prosperous agricultural center, with grain elevators, a small downtown district, and the kind of post-war optimism that characterized rural America during the Eisenhower era. The town was led by Mayor Harold Brennan, a 62-year-old farmer whose family had been among the original settlers, and whose word carried considerable weight in all community affairs. The spring planting season of 1958 had proceeded normally, with farmers working their fields under the vast Kansas sky while their wives tended gardens and children attended the red brick schoolhouse on Elm Street. Life moved at the unhurried pace of agricultural cycles, marked by church bells, harvest schedules, and the eternal hope that this year's crop would be better than the last. Pastor Friedrich Weber presided over St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, an imposing stone structure that dominated Millhaven's modest skyline. The church had been built to last with thick limestone walls and a bell tower that rose 127 feet above the prairie, housing a massive bronze bell that had been cast in Germany and shipped to Kansas at considerable expense in 1889. Pastor Weber was a thoughtful man in his late 50s who had served the Millhaven community for over 20 years, guiding his congregation through the Great Depression, World War II, and the uncertainties of the early Cold War. The bell tower held special significance for the people of Millhaven. It had served as a beacon for travelers crossing the prairie, a gathering point during emergencies, and most importantly, a symbol of the community's faith and permanence. The bell itself, known locally as Big Martha, rang out every Sunday morning and on special occasions, its deep bronze voice carrying across the farmland to call the faithful to worship. What the good people of Millhaven didn't know was that their beloved bell tower had been serving a far different purpose since the winter of 1957. Pastor Weber, despite his outward appearance of Christian devotion, had become involved with a group of individuals whose interests extended far beyond conventional religious practice. These people, led by a mysterious figure known only as the Curator, had convinced Weber that humanity was on the verge of a spiritual awakening that required special preparation and sacrifice. The Curator was Dr. Marcus Thorne, a former psychiatrist from the University of Chicago who had lost his medical license in 1954 after conducting unauthorized experiments on mental patients. Dr. Thorne had developed radical theories about human consciousness and the possibility of preserving spiritual essence beyond physical death. His research had taken increasingly dark turns, involving subjects who disappeared from state institutions without official record. Dr. Thorne had chosen Millhaven for his experiments because of its isolation, its trusting population, and most importantly, because of Pastor Weber's crisis of faith. Weber had been struggling with doubts about traditional Christianity and had become susceptible to Thorne's promises of demonstrating the reality of the human soul through scientific means. The experiments began in November 1957, when Dr. Thorne arrived in Millhaven posing as a traveling evangelist interested in documenting rural faith traditions. He established himself in a farmhouse on the outskirts of town and began carefully selecting subjects from among the community's most vulnerable members: elderly residents without family, transients passing through during harvest season, and individuals struggling with mental illness or addiction. The bell tower of St. Matthew's Church became Dr. Thorne's primary laboratory. Pastor Weber, convinced that he was participating in groundbreaking spiritual research, allowed Thorne to convert the tower's upper levels into a sophisticated facility for what Thorne called consciousness preservation experiments. The thick stone walls provided perfect sound insulation, while the tower's height ensured privacy from curious townspeople. Dr. Thorne's experiments involved subjecting his victims to prolonged psychological torture, sensory deprivation, and chemical treatments designed to induce what he believed were transcendent states of consciousness. He documented everything meticulously, believing that he was mapping the process by which the human soul separated from the physical body. His ultimate goal was to develop techniques for preserving consciousness indefinitely, creating what he termed immortal spiritual entities. The victims were typically held in the bell tower for weeks or months before dying from the trauma of Thorne's procedures. Their bodies were disposed of in various ways, some buried in remote locations, others dissolved in acid, and still others fed into farm equipment during harvest season when the presence of organic matter wouldn't attract attention. By the spring of 1958, Dr. Thorne had killed at least 17 people in his tower laboratory, with Pastor Weber serving as his willing accomplice and several other community members recruited as assistants. The conspiracy included Mayor Brennan, who helped cover up the disappearances, and Dr. Samuel Harrison, the town's physician, who provided medical equipment and falsified death certificates when necessary. The operation might have continued indefinitely, if not for the weather phenomenon that struck Millhaven on the evening of May 15, 1958. The tornado that devastated the town was later classified as an F4, with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour and a damage path nearly a mile wide. But weather experts would later note that the tornado's behavior was unusually erratic, as if it had been guided by some malevolent intelligence. The storm struck without warning just after sunset, when most of the town's residents were at home with their families. The tornado moved directly through the center of Millhaven, destroying virtually every structure, except for St. Matthew's Church and its bell tower, which stood untouched in the midst of complete devastation. The survival of the church while everything around it was obliterated would be hailed as a miracle by the few survivors, though the reality was far more sinister. When rescue teams arrived the following morning, they found a scene of total destruction. Houses had been reduced to splinters, businesses had vanished completely, and the town's grain elevators had been twisted into unrecognizable metal sculptures. Most shocking was the death toll. Of Millhaven's 847 residents, only 23 survived the tornado, and these survivors all reported being in the church basement when the storm struck. The survivors' account was remarkably consistent. They claimed that Pastor Weber had received a divine revelation about the approaching storm and had gathered the faithful in the church basement for a prayer vigil. The tornado had struck while they were praying, and they had been miraculously spared while the rest of the community perished. The survivors included Pastor Weber, Mayor Brennan, Dr. Harrison, and 20 other residents, who all vouched for this version of events. Federal disaster relief teams and insurance investigators found the survivors' story plausible, if extraordinarily fortunate. Tornadoes were known to create bizarre patterns of destruction, and the survival of a small group in a sturdy basement was not unprecedented. The fact that the church itself had survived intact was unusual but not impossible, given the building's solid construction and favorable location. What the investigators didn't know was that the survivor's story was entirely fabricated. The tornado had indeed struck Millhaven with devastating force, but the 23 survivors had been carefully selected and hidden in the church basement by Dr. Thorne and his conspirators. The divine revelation had actually been advanced knowledge of the storm obtained through Weather Bureau contacts who were part of Thorne's broader network. Dr. Thorne had seen the approaching tornado as an opportunity to cover up his experiments and create a new identity for himself and his key collaborators. The storm would eliminate all evidence of the missing persons and provide a tragic but natural explanation for the town's destruction. The survivors would be seen as fortunate victims deserving of sympathy and assistance, not as participants in mass murder. The morning after the tornado, as rescue workers searched through the debris for bodies and survivors, Dr. Thorne quietly left Millhaven with several truckloads of equipment and research materials that he had stored in the church bell tower. His departure went unnoticed in the chaos of the disaster response, and he successfully disappeared into the American countryside with his life's work intact. The official investigation into the Millhaven tornado concluded that 824 people had perished in the storm, making it one of the deadliest single tornado events in Kansas history. The bodies that were recovered were buried in a mass grave in the town cemetery, while the missing were presumed to have been carried away by the storm's incredible winds. Memorial services were held across the state, and the Millhaven survivors became celebrities of sorts, their story of faith and survival inspiring people throughout the region. Federal disaster assistance helped the survivors relocate to other communities across Kansas and beyond. Most scattered to different states seeking to start new lives away from the traumatic memories of their destroyed hometown. Pastor Weber moved to Denver, where he established a new congregation and became known for his powerful sermons about surviving tragedy through faith. Mayor Brennan relocated to Topeka and eventually became a successful insurance agent, specializing in disaster coverage. Dr. Harrison moved to California and opened a private practice treating trauma victims. The ruins of Millhaven were left largely undisturbed for decades. The federal government purchased the land for a nominal sum and designated it as a memorial park, though few visitors ever came to the remote site. St. Matthew's Church remained standing amid the empty prairie, its bell tower serving as a lonely monument to the vanished community. Over the years, the church building gradually deteriorated due to weather and neglect. Windows broke, the roof developed leaks, and the interior was damaged by water and wildlife. But the bell tower remained structurally sound, its thick stone walls continuing to protect whatever secrets lay within. Local legends began to grow around the abandoned church. Travelers reported hearing the bell ringing on still nights, despite the fact that no one was there to ring it. Others claimed to see lights in the tower windows and strange figures moving around the ruins. These stories were generally dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations and the human tendency to create ghost stories around tragic locations. In 1998, 40 years after the tornado, the state of Kansas decided to restore St. Matthew's Church as a historical monument and memorial to the Millhaven tragedy. The project was funded through a combination of state historical preservation funds and donations from religious organizations across the Midwest. The restoration was intended to return the church to its 1958 appearance and create a proper memorial space for visitors. The restoration project was assigned to Hawkins Construction Company of Wichita, a firm specializing in historical building preservation. The company's owner, Robert Hawkins, was a meticulous craftsman who took pride in authentic restoration work. He assembled a team of skilled workers and began the careful process of stabilizing and repairing the century-old structure. Work began in the spring of 2008, exactly 50 years after the tornado. The restoration team started with the main church building, repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, and restoring the interior woodwork and furnishings. The work proceeded smoothly for several months, with no indication of the horrors that would soon be uncovered. It was in September 2008 that the construction team finally gained access to the upper levels of the bell tower. The tower had been sealed since the 1958 restoration efforts immediately following the tornado, when emergency workers had checked it for structural damage and then locked it to prevent unauthorized access. Robert Hawkins had obtained the original keys from state archives and was eager to assess the condition of the tower's interior. The team's first climb up the narrow spiral staircase of the bell tower seemed routine. The lower levels contained the expected accumulation of decades of dust, debris, and bird nests. The bell mechanism itself was in remarkably good condition, though the ropes had rotted away and would need to be replaced. It wasn't until they reached the uppermost chamber, directly below the bell housing, that they made their horrifying discovery. The chamber had been converted into what could only be described as a laboratory of horrors. The walls were lined with metal shelving that held hundreds of glass containers, each containing what appeared to be preserved human organs, suspended in clear fluid. Elaborate medical equipment filled the space, including devices that none of the construction workers recognized but which had clearly been designed for surgical procedures. Most disturbing were the detailed charts and photographs that covered every available wall surface. These documents appeared to record systematic experiments on human subjects, with clinical notes describing procedures that had clearly resulted in death. The photographs showed victims in various stages of what could only be described as torture, their faces twisted in agony as they were subjected to procedures too horrible to describe in detail. Robert Hawkins immediately contacted local law enforcement, and within hours the bell tower was crawling with investigators from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the county coroner's office. What they found exceeded their worst expectations and would eventually lead to one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Kansas history. The laboratory contained evidence of systematic human experimentation that had taken place over a period of several months in 1957 and 1958. The preserved organs appeared to be trophies taken from victims, while the medical equipment had been used to perform procedures that had no legitimate scientific or medical purpose. The documents revealed the scope of Dr. Thorne's experiments and identified him as the primary perpetrator. More shocking was the discovery that the experiments had involved willing participants from the Millhaven community. The documents included signed agreements from Pastor Weber, Mayor Brennan, Dr. Harrison, and several other residents who had agreed to assist with the research in exchange for financial compensation and promises of spiritual enlightenment. FBI investigators quickly realized that they were dealing with a mass murder case that had been covered up for 50 years. The tornado had provided the perfect opportunity for the perpetrators to eliminate evidence and create new identities. But their arrogance in preserving trophies and documentation had finally exposed their crimes. The investigation expanded to track down the surviving conspirators. Pastor Weber was located in a Denver nursing home, suffering from advanced dementia but still alive at the age of 96. Mayor Brennan had died in 2003, but his family was shocked to learn of his involvement in the Millhaven murders. Dr. Harrison was found living under an assumed name in Santa Barbara, California, where he had built a successful psychiatric practice treating wealthy clients. When confronted with the evidence from the bell tower, Dr. Harrison initially denied any involvement in the experiments. However, when investigators showed him photographs of the preserved organs and his own handwriting on medical charts, he broke down and confessed to his role in the conspiracy. Harrison's confession revealed the full scope of the Millhaven horror. He described how Dr. Thorne had convinced the community leaders that they were participating in groundbreaking research that would revolutionize understanding of human consciousness. The victims had been carefully selected from among transients and vulnerable residents who wouldn't be missed immediately. Most disturbing was Harrison's revelation that the 23 tornado survivors had not been chosen randomly. They were the core members of Dr. Thorne's conspiracy, carefully protected in the church basement while the tornado destroyed all evidence of their crimes. The storm had been the culmination of a plan that had been months in the making. Harrison also revealed what had happened to Dr. Thorne after his disappearance from Millhaven. The mad doctor had continued his experiments at other locations across the country, always staying ahead of authorities and leaving no traces of his activities. Harrison had maintained contact with Thorne until the late 1960s, when the doctor had supposedly perfected his consciousness preservation techniques and achieved what he called transcendence. The investigation into the Millhaven murders eventually identified 43 victims who had been killed in Dr. Thorne's experiments. The preserved organs in the bell tower were matched to missing persons reports from across Kansas and surrounding states, providing closure for families who had wondered for decades about the fate of their loved ones. Dr. Harrison was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, though his advanced age and deteriorating health made prosecution difficult. He died in custody in 2009 before his case could come to trial, taking many secrets with him to the grave. The search for Dr. Thorne himself proved fruitless. FBI investigators tracked his movements through the 1960s and early 1970s, finding evidence of similar experimental laboratories in remote locations across the American West. But the trail went cold in 1974, when Thorne appeared to have vanished completely. Whether he had died, successfully assumed a new identity, or achieved his goal of transcendence, remained a mystery. The discovery in the bell tower transformed understanding of the 1958 Millhaven tornado from a natural disaster into a cover-up for mass murder. The memorial park was redesigned to honor the 43 murder victims as well as the tornado fatalities, and the church was converted into a museum documenting both the tragedy and the investigation that finally brought the truth to light. The bell tower itself became the centerpiece of the memorial, with the preserved laboratory equipment displayed as evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. Visitors could climb the narrow stairs and see firsthand the chamber where Dr. Thorne had conducted his horrific experiments, though many found the experience too disturbing to complete. Robert Hawkins, the contractor whose restoration work had uncovered the evidence, became something of a local celebrity for his role in exposing the Millhaven conspiracy. He was commended by law enforcement agencies and historical preservation societies for his thorough work and his immediate response to the discovery. The Millhaven case prompted a broader investigation into other missing persons cases from the 1950s and 1960s, as investigators sought to identify other possible victims of Dr. Thorne's experiments. Similar discoveries were made at abandoned buildings in Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. suggesting that the Millhaven laboratory had been just one stop on a decades-long campaign of human experimentation. The case also led to reforms in how disaster investigations were conducted, with new protocols requiring more thorough examination of survivor testimonies and more comprehensive searches for evidence of criminal activity. The Millhaven conspiracy had succeeded for 50 years, partly because investigators had been too willing to accept natural explanations for unusual circumstances. For the families of Dr. Thorne's victims, the discovery brought a mixture of closure and renewed trauma. Many had spent decades wondering about the fate of missing relatives, and while they finally had answers, those answers were more horrible than they had ever imagined. Support groups were established to help families cope with the revelation that their loved ones had been victims of systematic torture and murder. The Bell Tower Laboratory also shed new light on the history of unauthorized human experimentation in the United States. The 1950s had been a period of extensive government and private research programs that often violated medical ethics and human rights, and Dr. Thorne's work appeared to be connected to this broader pattern of abuse. Historians and criminologists studied the Millhaven case as an example of how seemingly normal communities could become complicit in mass murder when manipulated by charismatic leaders with scientific credentials. The case highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining ethical oversight of research activities. The restored St. Matthew's Church drew thousands of visitors each year, though many found the experience deeply unsettling. The combination of the church's beautiful architecture and the horrific crimes that had been committed in its bell tower created a profound sense of cognitive dissonance that affected even the most hardened visitors. Local paranormal investigators reported unusual activity in and around the church, including unexplained sounds, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic anomalies. While these reports were generally dismissed by scientists, they added to the church's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in Kansas. The bell itself, Big Martha, was eventually restored to working condition and rang out over the empty prairie once again. But its voice seemed different to those who heard it, less of a call to worship and more of a lament for the innocents who had died in the tower below. Educational programs were developed around the Millhaven case, teaching students about the importance of questioning authority, recognizing manipulation, and protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The case became a standard example in ethics courses at medical and law schools across the country. Research into Dr. Thorne's background revealed connections to other notorious figures in the history of human experimentation, including researchers involved in the CIA's MKUltra program and Nazi war criminals who had been secretly brought to the United States after World War II. While these connections couldn't be definitively proven, they suggested that Thorne's work had been part of a much larger network of illegal and unethical research. The town of Millhaven itself was never rebuilt. The prairie reclaimed most of the tornado damage, and today only a few foundation stones and the occasional piece of twisted metal mark where the community once stood. The church and its bell tower remain the only substantial structures, standing as a lonely monument to both the victims of the tornado and the victims of Dr. Thorne's experiments. The macabre history of the village lost in the 1958 storm serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind facades of respectability and scientific progress. The bell tower that had once called a community to worship had concealed unspeakable horrors for 50 years, and its secrets might never have been revealed if not for the careful work of restoration craftsmen who refused to ignore what they had found. Today, as visitors stand in the shadow of St. Matthew's bell tower and listen to the wind whistling across the empty prairie, they are reminded that the past is never truly buried. Sometimes it takes decades for the truth to emerge, but when it does, it forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about human nature and the capacity for both great good and unimaginable evil that exists within seemingly ordinary communities. The bell tower that hid something unspeakable has become a symbol of the importance of bearing witness to historical crimes and ensuring that the victims are remembered and honored. The 43 people who died in Dr. Thorne's experiments finally received the recognition and justice they deserved, even though it came 50 years too late. The story of Millhaven continues to resonate with people who visit the memorial, read about the case, or study it in academic settings. It serves as a warning about the dangers of blind trust in authority figures and the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit others in the name of science, religion, or progress. In the end, The tornado that destroyed Millhaven in 1958 was not the community's greatest tragedy. The real tragedy was the systematic murder of innocent people by respected community leaders who had betrayed the trust placed in them. The storm was merely the final act in a drama of human evil that had been playing out in secret for months, hidden away in a bell tower that should have been a symbol of faith and hope. The discovery 50 years later proved that no secret stays buried forever, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be served even across the span of decades. The bell tower's horrible secret was finally exposed, allowing the victims to find peace and ensuring that their murderers could no longer hide behind the lies they had told for half a century.